She was called Malika-e-Alam, Queen of the World. As a girl, she was summoned to eat breakfast from the hand of an emperor. And when she approached him, she trembled so badly she could barely walk in a straight line back to her seat. 16 years later, she was stumbling barefoot through those same streets, dragging her little sister by the hand, begging a servant to send a palanquin that would never come, on roads where crowds had once bowed low as she rode past on an elephant. By the end of that year, her father had ridden alone into a jungle and vanished, and no one in her family ever discovered what became of him. This is the story of a Mughal princess, and of what an empire's collapse actually does to the people inside it. Not the armies, not the emperors whose faces end up on coins and in textbooks. The daughters. To understand what she lost, you first have to understand what the Mughal court still was, even in its decline. The dynasty had ruled parts of the Indian subcontinent since 1526, and at its height, economic historians estimate it commanded something close to a quarter of the entire world's economic output. By the time Bahadur Shah Zafar became emperor in 1837, at the age of 62, almost none of that remained. His real authority stretched barely beyond the walled city of Old Delhi. He was, in practical terms, a pensioner of the British East India Company, allowed to keep his title, his palace, and his rituals, but not his power. And yet inside the Red Fort, the old world hadn't disappeared. Zafar himself was a serious poet, known by the pen name he wrote under, and a devoted Sufi. Breakfast was still served in his presence every morning. Children were still summoned to eat with him, to receive food from his own hand. And when they were summoned, they still bowed 3 times from the waist, exactly the way they had been taught to since infancy, because that was simply how the world worked, and none of them had any reason yet to think it could stop working that way. One of those children was a granddaughter named Sultan Bano. Her father was Mirza Kaivash Bahadur, a son of Zafar who, by her own account decades later, had been recognized as heir apparent in 1856, after the death of the previous crown prince left the succession open. She grew up inside the zinana, the women's quarters of the palace, learning embroidery and the household arts considered proper for a princess, close to a brother 2 years older than her named Mirza Yawar Shah, and a sister years younger named Naz Bano. She would later recall that the emperor was especially fond of her, that she was called to breakfast with him often, and that once, when she barely touched her food out of nervous respect, he gently told her that being humble didn't mean she had to get up from the table still hungry. She was, by her own account, 16 years old in the spring of 1857, 2 years younger than her brother Yawar Shah, and 6 years older than Naz Bano. Yawar Shah, as the son of the man now recognized as Crown Prince, had been raised with tutors in calligraphy, Arabic and Persian, in archery, the full education expected of a boy who might one day sit on what remained of the Mughal throne. Sultan Bano would later say her father had dreamed of seeing him married soon, dressed in the traditional garland of flowers, and pearls a Mughal bridegroom wore over his face at his own wedding. That wedding never happened. She had no idea, that spring, that within a matter of months, everything she understood about her own life would be gone, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of exactly how it happened. What happened that spring is well documented in outline, even if the details inside the palace are harder to reconstruct. Sepoys, Indian soldiers serving under British command, revolted against the East India Company in May of 1857 and marched on Delhi, and once inside the city, they pressed the elderly, reluctant Zafar into becoming the symbolic head of their rebellion. He had little real choice in the matter. He had no army of his own, no independent revenue, and at 82 years old, not much appetite for the role he was being handed. What followed was months of siege as British forces gathered outside the city walls, and conditions inside deteriorated steadily. Food scarce. The white marble palaces that had gleamed along the Yamuna River for 2 centuries were blackened by soot from gunfire and cannon shots. Members of the imperial household later described going a day and a half at a stretch without eating, hunger severe enough that nursing mothers in the palace stopped being able to produce milk for their own infants. For a 16-year-old princess who had never walked further than the length of a palace courtyard in her entire life, none of that mattered yet, not really, not until September. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What do you actually do if you're a teenage girl who has spent her whole life being told exactly how to bow, exactly when to speak, exactly who is and isn't allowed to look you in the eye? And in the space of a single week, all of that protection simply stops existing. Sultan Bano never answers that question directly in her own account. She just describes what happened to her next, which answers it better than any reflection could. Delhi fell to British forces on the 14th of September, 1857. The recapture was brutal, and in the days that followed, the emperor and what remained of his family fled to Humayun's tomb, a vast mausoleum complex on the outskirts of the city, because by then it was simply the only place left to go. It was there, among the graves of his own ancestors, that the last Mughal emperor made what amounted to a final stand, though it wasn't military. It was surrender. A British officer named Major William Hodson surrounded the tomb with a force of irregular cavalry, and on the 20th of September, Zafar gave himself up on the promise that his life would be spared. What Sultan Bano remembered from that day was not politics. It was watching a member of her own extended family shot dead in front of her, and a cousin who rushed at the killer with a drawn sword and was shot down as well, collapsing across the body. She said afterward that she stood there like a statue, unable to move, until a palace servant came and told her that her father was calling for her. She followed him in a daze. Near one of the gates, she found her father, Mirza Kaivash, bareheaded, his hair full of dust and straw, seated on a horse with nowhere left to go and no time left to go there. According to her account, he told her that her brother, Yawar Shah, the boy she had been closest to her entire life, had just been killed in front of him by a soldier. It's worth being honest here. This is her memory, given to a writer more than 50 years after the fact, and the precise sequence of who died where and exactly when doesn't line up perfectly with every other surviving record of that day. But the emotional core of what she describes, a father saying goodbye to his children because he no longer has any way to protect them, isn't in dispute anywhere. He told her she was old enough now to look after her little sister. He told Naz Bano, who was still a child, that she was no longer a princess, that she needed to be grateful for whatever food she was given from now on, and stop making the kind of demands she used to make of the servants. Then he placed both girls in the care of an old family attendant, Akuwa Asara, embraced them, and rode off alone into the countryside. Sultan Bano never saw him again. She never learned what became of him. 50 years later, telling her story to a writer named Khwaja Hassan Nizami, that unanswered question was still sitting there, unresolved, the one loose thread in her entire account that never got tied off. Where did a Mughal crown prince disappear to on a horse in September of 1857? Nobody, including his daughter, ever found out. What came next was, in its own way, worse than the violence had been. Naz Bano had never walked more than a few steps outside a palace in her entire life. Neither had her sister. Somewhere along the road, a thorn pierced Naz Bano's foot, and she collapsed, crying, unable to go any further. According to Sultan Bano's account, the servant entrusted with protecting them showed no sympathy at all. He told them to hurry up and keep moving. When the exhausted, grieving child snapped back at him the way she'd been used to speaking to servants her whole life, he slapped her across the face. Sultan Bano said afterward that no one had ever laid a hand on either of them before, not once, in their entire lives. Her sister was so shocked she simply trembled where she stood. The servant then walked off and left both girls crying on the road, alone, with no protector left at all. Somehow, the two of them made it on foot to the shrine of the Sufi Saint Nizamuddin Aulia on the edge of Delhi, where thousands of other refugees, many from their own extended family, had already gathered with nowhere else to go. Sultan Bano described a strange, silent kind of misery there. Everyone was consumed by their own grief. No one had the energy left over to comfort anyone else. And then disease, the kind that spreads quickly through displaced crowds without clean water or food, swept through the camp, and her little sister died there. Sultan Bano was left completely alone, 16 years old, effectively orphaned, in a city her family had ruled for 231 years. She was not the only Mughal princess living through her own version of that same night. In a different part of the fleeing court, another daughter of Zafar, a woman named Kulsum Zamani Begum, had her own last audience with her father before the end. She later described how the emperor summoned her in the middle of the night, sitting on his prayer mat with a rosary in his hands, and told her he was placing her in God's care now, that if fate allowed it, they would meet again, but that keeping her with him meant certain destruction for her as well. She had a daughter of her own at the time, not yet 2 years old, crying from hunger, because none of the women around her had enough left in their own bodies to nurse an infant anymore. Before sending her away with her husband, the emperor prayed aloud, asking that the honor of the Timurid princesses now fleeing into open wilderness be protected, since he no longer had any way to protect it himself. Kulsum Zamani Begum's cart left the Red Fort before dawn. She said later that only the morning star was still visible in the sky by then, that every other star had already faded, and that she and the women traveling with her wept as they took what they assumed would be their last look at the palace where they had all been raised. They reached a village called Kurali and were fed coarse millet bread and buttermilk by their cart driver's own family. Food so far beneath they were used to that Kulsum said it tasted better than anything served in the imperial kitchens, because she had never in her entire life been that hungry before. It didn't last. The very next day, local villagers descended on the group and stripped them of every last piece of jewelry they had left, the one remaining thing standing between them and total destitution. And that is when the story could have ended the way so many others did. It didn't, because of a man named Basti, a local landowner who happened to be passing by when he heard Kulsum's infant daughter crying, and she called out asking him for water. He brought them water in an earthen cup and, according to her account, said 7 words that changed everything. "From today, you are my sister." He had no obligation to them whatsoever. He wasn't a courtier or a servant who owed the dynasty anything at all. When the group later tried to seek shelter with a physician who had served the imperial family for years, the man refused outright, telling them plainly that he wasn't willing to risk his own house on their account. Basti did the opposite. He stayed with them for weeks, escorting the group across hundreds of miles until they reached safety in Hyderabad, and was eventually sent home with whatever small reward the family could still scrape together, which by every account was far less than his loyalty had actually been worth. Kulsum's husband made a modest living for a while as a calligrapher and a teacher of the Quran. Eventually, with help arranged through the family of Zafar's own spiritual advisor, they were able to travel on to Mecca for the Hajj pilgrimage, disguised in the plain clothing of wandering religious dervishes so as not to draw attention. On the journey, she later recalled, a Hindu shopkeeper in the port town of Aden, who had no idea who they really were, asked which order of holy travelers they belonged to. Kulsum answered that they were followers of a wronged king and teacher whose crown had been taken from him by force, and that they longed only for one more glimpse of his face. The shopkeeper, by her account, began to weep. Years later, they returned to Delhi, where the British government granted her a pension of 10 rupees a month. She said afterward that she almost laughed when she was told the amount. They had taken her father's empire, she said, and offered her 10 rupees a month in exchange for it. Zoom out from these two women for a moment, and a pattern starts to become visible. This wasn't an isolated tragedy affecting 2 unlucky families. It was the general condition of an entire scattered royal house. Male descendants of the dynasty later ended up begging on the same their ancestors had once ridden through in procession, some of them left physically disabled by disease or injury, surviving on a British pension that in several recorded cases was fixed at somewhere around 5 rupees a month, and that is the exact figure Sultan Bano herself said she was still receiving decades later, when she finally sat down to tell her story to a writer who was racing to collect testimony from survivors before it disappeared for good. That writer was Khwaja Hassan Nizami, and the fact that any of this survives at all is largely because of him. He was a Delhi-based writer and Sufi thinker who spent years tracking down aging survivors of the Mughal collapse and recording what they remembered before they died, and took it with them. In 1922, he published their testimonies in a book called Begumat Ki Ansu, Tears of the Begums, a title that turned out to be exactly right. Without that book, Sultan Bano's account of her father riding into the jungle and Kulsum Zamani Begum's account of a stranger's kindness on a road outside Karali would almost certainly the way so much of women's history from this period did, unrecorded, simply because no one in power thought it was worth writing down. What happened to Bahadur Shah Zafar himself, meanwhile, was unfolding on its own separate, more visible track, and it's worth pausing on, because it shaped the pension his scattered daughters would spend the rest of their lives living on. The British put him on trial inside his own Red Fort. He was convicted of aiding the rebellion, and because Hodson had guaranteed his life on the day of the surrender, his sentence was exile rather than execution. In October of 1858, at 83 years old, he was loaded into a bullock cart before dawn and sent more than 2,000 miles away, to Rangoon in British Burma, a journey of weeks by cart and by ship. He died there 4 years later in November of 1862, and the British deliberately buried him in an unmarked grave, because they understood correctly that a marked tomb belonging to the last Mughal emperor would become a rallying point they'd rather not deal with. For 129 years, nobody knew exactly where he was buried. It wasn't until 1991, when construction workers in what is now Yangon accidentally uncovered the site, that his grave was identified at all. There's a strange symmetry in that. The man who had once composed a well-known verse lamenting that he might not even find 2 yards of land for his own burial in the country he loved spent over a century proving himself right, buried in soil that wasn't his, in a country that wasn't his, under no name at all. His daughters, meanwhile, were living out a quieter version of the same erasure back in India, each of them alone with a 5 or 10 rupee pension and a story nobody was writing down, until one man finally decided their words were worth preserving exactly as they were spoken. None of this happened in a vacuum, either. Once Delhi was back in British hands, the reprisals against the royal family were systematic. Mughal properties were confiscated. Large sections of the Red Fort itself, the marble apartments, the gardens, the private quarters where children like Sultan Bano had once eaten breakfast with an emperor, were demolished within weeks to make way for a British army garrison. There was no possibility of any of Zafar's descendants simply going home again, because in a very literal sense, home had been torn down. That is the backdrop against which a 5 rupee pension has to be understood. Not as a modest allowance for people who'd lost a throne, but as the entire remaining safety net for people who had lost their houses, their income, and in many cases their families, all within the same few weeks. A genealogical organization called the Mughal Trust has spent recent years trying to map exactly how far that scattering went. Their research has identified something in the range of 270 probable descendants of the dynasty alive today, spread mostly across Kolkata and Aurangabad, with others believed to be living in Pakistan, in Myanmar, and in scattered cities across India. Most carry no title and receive no special recognition from the Indian state. Some work as laborers, some as teachers, some as small merchants. The family that once produced 20 emperors is now, by any practical measure, an ordinary extended family that happens to know its own extraordinary history. The line from Sultan Bano and Kulsum Zamani Begum to the present day is longer than you might expect, and it isn't finished yet. A woman named Sultana Begum, who says she is the great-granddaughter-in-law of Bahadur Shah Zafar through her late husband, Mirza Muhammad Bedar Bakat, has spent years living in a slum on the outskirts of Kolkata, surviving on a government pension of roughly 6,000 rupees a month, a little over the cost of a modest week of groceries. In 2021, she filed a court case seeking recognition as the rightful owner of the Red Fort, the palace her husband's ancestors built and were driven out of by force. In May of 2025, India's Supreme Court dismissed her petition. Speaking to reporters afterward, she said she was shattered. and that she would keep pursuing justice anyway. Because, in her own words, the man whose descendants she belongs to never betrayed his country, even though his country, in her view, had never fully repaid him. Her story became the subject of a documentary released that same year, called Lost Queen. She is not Sultan Bano, and she is not Kulsum Zamani Begum. Nearly 170 years separate them. But she is proof that the story this family has quietly been trying to tell about itself. In testimonies, in interviews, in court filings nobody expects to win, has never actually stopped. It's worth asking why these particular stories survived at all, when so much of what happened to Mughal women in 1857 didn't. Purdah, the practice of secluding women of the household from unrelated men, meant that royal women were rarely named or described in official British records of the rebellion the way male princes were. The soldiers who wrote reports, the officers who testified at Zafar's trial, the newspapers that covered the fall of Delhi, none of them were particularly interested in what happened to a 16-year-old girl once she disappeared into a refugee camp at a Sufi shrine. If Khwaja Hassan Nizami hadn't gone looking for her decades later, hadn't sat with her and let her tell the story in her own words and in her own order, printing it more or less exactly as she gave it to him, Sultan Bano would simply be a name buried somewhere in a genealogical chart if she appeared at all. The same is true of Kulsum Zamani Begum. Her daughter Zainab, the infant who couldn't be nursed on the night they fled the fort, was still alive when Nizami collected the account. And it's very possibly through her that some of the smaller details, the earthen cup of water, the 7 words a stranger said to a desperate mother on a village road, survived to be written down. What strikes me most, going back through all of these accounts, isn't the scale of what the Mughals lost, although the scale is real. Historians can measure territory and revenue and put a number on how much of the world's wealth an empire like this once commanded. What's harder to measure, and what a book like Begumat Kiansu exists specifically to preserve, is what it actually felt like to be a 16-year-old girl watching her own die in front of her, being told by her father in the same breath that she was now responsible for her little sister, and then only months later having no sister left to be responsible for. Sultan Bano lived out the rest of her life on a 5-rupee pension and a question she never got to answer. What actually happened to her father on the horse, riding into the jungle, and where he went? History remembers the emperor. It very nearly forgot her entirely, and it would have if one writer hadn't decided her testimony, exactly as she spoke it, was worth sitting down and recording for good. If you've made it this far, I think that says something about you, and I'd genuinely like to know. If you could sit across from Sultan Bano the way Khwaja Hassan Nizami once did, what's the one question you would actually want to ask her? Let me know in the comments, and if stories like this are the kind you want more of, consider subscribing, because there are a lot more of them still waiting to be told properly.